So today I wanted to start out with some additional information on factoring, and we're going to do factoring by grouping and leading coefficients other than 1 for today. So the first thing, and again, here's some notes that I provided for you. You have access to these whenever you need them. I want you to remember to come back to this page and use these notes whenever you need. You can print them out so that you can use them on tests and quizzes as well if you would like. So factor by grouping, anytime you see 4 terms, you're going to want to use the factor by grouping method. You can arrange the terms in any order that you want. So if you're looking at a polynomial that has 4 terms, you can move things around so that it's easier for you to factor. But it really shouldn't matter which order they're in order to factor them. You can factor both sets of binomials and you should end up with the same answer no matter which order. So what you're going to do is you're going to group the first 2 terms together and then the second 2 terms together, and then you're going to look for a greatest common factor from each of those binomials. When you find a greatest common factor, you're going to pull them out, and then you should be left with the common binomial factor. So you're going to have 2 numbers multiplied together, and you're going to look for the common binomial factor. So this, like I said again, is just the notes. And then this page is the actual example. So factoring by grouping, notice I have 4 terms. I'm going to group the first 2 terms together by using a set of parentheses and the second 2 terms together by using a set of parentheses. Then I'm going to look in each of the 2 binomials and I'm going to say, is there anything in common between the x to the third plus 5z to the second? And is there anything in common between a negative 4z minus 20? In the first binomial, I see a z squared is in common. That's the greatest common factor, so I'm left with a z plus 5. In the second binomial, I notice that if I take out a negative 4, I'm also left with a z plus 5. Notice that these 2 binomials are now common binomials. So I'm going to factor those common binomials out, and then I'm going to take what's left over, so the z squared minus 4, and that becomes my second binomial. At this point, I'm going to allow you to leave these like this, but a little bit later on, in one of our next lessons, we're going to see that this z squared minus 4 can be factored further. So we'll have to do a little bit more work with that. But again, anytime you see 4 terms, you're going to want to group them. So you can group the first 2 and the last 2 terms together. And again, if you need to move anything around, you can. Just always remember, whatever the operation is in front of a number or in front of a term tells you if it's positive or negative, and you always want to move that with it. If you have a leading coefficient other than 1, now this process really isn't any different than what I showed you with the leading coefficient of 1. It's that AC method where you take that third term, multiply it by the leading coefficient. So this is going to be the same thing. You're going to want to make sure it's in standard form. So you want your leading coefficient, your very first term, to be positive. So if it's negative, you're going to factor a negative 1 out. Make sure you factor a negative 1 from each of the other terms. So your sign should be changing as you factor out that negative. Then you're going to want to do the AC method and find that product in the sum. So multiply the constant term, the third term, by the leading coefficient. So your C term times your A, you're going to get that product. Then you're going to find all the factors of that product and then find out which ones combine together to give you the center term as your sum. Remember to keep in mind any of your positives and your negatives. Once you do that, you can rewrite it. Now this part, you have to rewrite it as 4 terms. Once you rewrite it as 4 terms, then you can use your factor by grouping, which we just learned. So you're going to group the first 2 terms together and the last 2 terms together. So again, these are the notes that you will use, and here's the practice example. So our original problem is going to be 2w to the 4th minus 7w to the 3rd minus 15w squared. That's our original problem. If there's a common factor, we want to factor that out first. The reason why we do that is because it's going to make factoring any problem a lot easier, because then our numbers become a little bit smaller or our variables become smaller. So in this case, I have a w squared that I can factor out of each term. So I'm going to take that w squared out. I'm left with a 2w squared minus 7w minus 15. So at this point, now I'm going to use that AC method, and I'm going to take the 15 and I'm going to multiply it, or the negative 15, because there's a negative in front of it. So negative 15 times the 2. So 2 times negative 15 is equal to negative 30. I'm going to go through and find all of the products that equal negative 30. So negative 1 times 30 is negative 30. 1 times negative 30 is negative 30. And you guys can see the process and notice there are a lot of different factors. So I have them all written, and then I find out, well, which one works that's also going to be the sum of this negative 15 here in the middle. So, negative 7 here in the middle. Sorry, I was on the wrong one. So we want the negative 7 here in the middle, negative 7w. And once I have that, or once I have the factors that I think are the right ones, I'm going to look and say, well, positive 3 plus a negative 10 is going to actually equal the negative 7. So I'm going to rewrite it with those two factors. So I'm going to have the w squared times 2w squared plus 3w minus 10w minus 15. So notice that these factors, the 3 went here as a 3w, and the negative 10 went here as a negative 10w. Then I'm going to factor by grouping. Now the key piece here is that we cannot forget about this w squared. So we have to keep that. So in this case, I just added a set of brackets just to keep it separate from everything else that I'm doing in here so that I don't accidentally make a mistake. So I'm going to look inside the first set of parentheses and see if there's a greatest common factor, and then inside the second set of parentheses to see if I have a common factor. On the first one, my common factor happens to be a w, so I'm going to take a w out, and I'm left with a 2w plus 3. In the second set of parentheses, I'm going to look at it and see what can be factored out. And in this case, I can take out a negative 5. So if I take out a negative 5, I'm going to be left with a 2w plus 3. And then I have these common binomials. And I'm going to factor out those. So remember, keep that w squared. It stays in my final answer. We do not want to remove it from our final answer. We're going to factor out the common binomial, the 2w plus 3. And then we're going to take and write what's left over. And in this case, we have the w and the negative 5, which gives us the w minus negative 5. So as you're looking through these, you should notice that each step is written out completely for you so you can follow along and you can see each step. So if I had a different problem, I could just take and remove the math work, and the steps should all be the same from one to the next. Okay, so to re-look at this, if we factor by grouping, anytime we see 4 terms, we're going to want to factor by grouping. You can group any of the terms together in any order that you want. You just have to remember to keep the sign of the number that's in front of it, or the sign of the term that's in front of it, and make sure you move it with it. So if you do rearrange them, you can do that. Once you have them, you group the first 2, the second 2, and you look to see if there's common factors. So we're going to take out the common factors, and we're going to look for common binomials. So whenever you factor something out and factor by grouping, we should hopefully see those common binomials that we can take out. And if we don't, we probably have what's called prime, that you can't factor. So if these 2 binomials don't match, we most likely do not have a factorable polynomial, and that is possible to have. Now, I will give you a key piece of information on this. Very rarely am I going to give you a test that is going to have more than one prime polynomial. So if you're taking a test or a quiz and you notice you have multiple prime polynomials, you're going to want to double check on that because most likely you may be factored incorrectly. So always double check that. Okay, the second thing that we talked about today is a leading coefficient other than 1. And like I said, this is no different than what we were doing last week. You're going to do the same exact steps. So you're going to first check to see if there's a greatest common factor that you can factor out of the entire trinomial. In this case, we have a w squared. Then you're going to multiply the constant term in the back times the leading coefficient. And then you're going to list out all the factors of that product. Once you have the factors of the product, you want to see which ones, when added together, will give you this center term, this negative 7w. So if I have a positive 3 and a negative 10, that would give me a negative 7w. So that's why I chose to use that to rewrite into 4 terms. And it's always easier to write into 4 terms because then I can use my factor by grouping. And then with my factor by grouping, I just go back to what I did at the beginning, looking for a greatest common factor, factor out that greatest common factor, look for those common binomials. Once I have the common binomials, I'm going to factor that out, and I'm going to be left with w minus 2 here in this case. So what's outside the binomials is what's left over, And then don't ever forget about that GCF that you factored out at the beginning in order to finish the problem. So that pretty much is all that I have for you guys for today. And then after that, you do have a couple of worksheets to work on. And hopefully I'll be able to meet with you guys later this week. If you have any questions or if you need any help with anything, let me know so that I can put together a time to meet with you. Send me an email and we will schedule something. Give me a couple of times that work for you, whether it's during school time or after school time, and we will make an arrangement so that we can touch base and go over any of the questions you might have. If that is not an option for you, you can always reach out to any other math teacher in the math department and ask for help, and I'm sure that everybody will be more than happy to help you.